If she dies because of this, you'll never forget my face." The words hit the rain-soaked parking lot like a crack of thunder. Dr. Naomi Carter stood beside her silver Honda Accord with both hands raised chest high, her navy blue scrubs streaked with water and a smear of blood near the sleeve of her jacket. Red and blue lights flashed across the wet pavement, reflecting off puddles like broken glass. Officer Daniel Reeves stepped forward cautiously, one hand resting near his holster, the other gripping a flashlight that cut sharply across Naomi's face. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle now." Naomi's chest rose hard with each breath. Somewhere beyond the sliding emergency room doors less than 50 yards away, monitors were beeping, nurses were moving fast, and a woman was bleeding out on an operating table. Naomi could almost feel the seconds disappearing. "I am a trauma surgeon," she said firmly, her voice shaking more from urgency than fear. "That patient needs me upstairs right now." Daniel's jaw tightened. Rain rolled down the side of his face as he glanced toward the open trunk of Naomi's car, where a cooler-marked blood transport unit sat half unzipped beneath a stack of medical folders. To him, nothing about the scene felt normal. A black woman speeding nearly 90 miles per hour through downtown Raleigh after midnight. Blood in the car. Emergency lights ignored for 3 full blocks. And now she expected him to simply let her walk away. "Turn around," he ordered. Naomi stared at him in disbelief. "Are you serious right now? Turn around." Her eyes darted toward the glowing hospital entrance again. Through the glass, she saw 2 nurses rush past pushing a crash cart. Her stomach twisted. "Officer, listen to me carefully," she said, forcing calm into every word. "A woman is hemorrhaging upstairs. Her blood pressure was dropping when they called me. I was bringing O-negative blood because the hospital bank was short after the freeway pileup tonight. If I do not get inside in the next few minutes, you should have pulled over when I lit you up." His voice cut through hers cold and flat. Naomi swallowed hard. The rain had turned heavier now, soaking through. The curls gathered at the back of her neck. "You really think I was trying to run from you?" she asked quietly. Daniel stepped closer. "I think people say a lot of things at midnight when they get caught." The words landed harder than the rain. Naomi felt something sharp move behind her ribs. Not fear exactly, something older than that. Exhaustion. The kind that came from spending years proving herself to rooms that never expected her to belong in them. She reached slowly into her jacket pocket. Daniel immediately stiffened. "Hands where I can see them." Naomi froze. "It's my hospital ID." Slowly, her fingers trembled as she pulled the badge free and held it toward him beneath the flashing lights. "Dr. Naomi Carter. Trauma surgery." Daniel glanced at it for barely half a second before looking back at her face instead. "Anybody can print a badge." Naomi blinked at him. For a moment, the entire parking lot seemed to go silent except for the distant roll of thunder overhead. Then somewhere inside the ER, a woman screamed. The sound carried faintly through the storm. Naomi turned toward the entrance instinctively. "That's my patient," she whispered. Her voice cracked for the first time. "Please." But Daniel was already reaching for the cuffs clipped to his belt. The metal cuffs clicked around Naomi's wrists with a sound that felt impossibly loud against the storm. For half a second, she simply stood there motionless, rain dripping from the edge of her jaw onto the soaked asphalt beneath her sneakers. Inside the emergency room, another alarm sounded faintly through the glass doors. Fast. Repeating. Urgent. Naomi closed her eyes. Somewhere upstairs, a woman she had never even met was losing blood by the second, while the only surgeon qualified to stop it stood handcuffed 20 feet from the hospital entrance. Daniel guided her toward the front of the patrol car, not rough, not aggressive, just certain. Certain he was doing the right thing. That certainty hurt more than anger would have. "Officer Reeves," Naomi said carefully, trying one last time to reach whatever humanity still existed beneath the badge and rain jacket. "I need you to understand what trauma response means. Internal bleeding is not something that waits politely while paperwork gets finished." Daniel opened the rear door of the cruiser. "And I need you to understand that speeding through downtown at 90 miles an hour with blood in your vehicle is not exactly normal behavior." Naomi laughed once under her breath, exhausted and bitter all at once. "You saw my ID. I saw a card. You saw a black woman and decided that mattered more." The words landed between them heavily. Daniel's expression flickered for the first time that night, just for a second, but Naomi caught it. Rainwater rolled down the side mirror beside them. Somewhere overhead, a helicopter crossed through the clouds toward the medical center roof. Naomi watched the blinking light disappear into the storm, and suddenly another memory surfaced in her mind, sharp and unwelcome. 15 years old, standing beside her mother inside a grocery store, while security guards checked their bags even though they had bought nothing but milk and bread. 21 years old, walking into medical school orientation and being handed directions to custodial services instead of registration because someone assumed she worked maintenance. 32 years old now, top trauma surgeon in one of the busiest hospitals in North Carolina, and still watching people hesitate before believing the word doctor belonged beside her name. Daniel lowered his flashlight slightly. Look, if everything you are saying checks out, then this gets cleared up downtown. Naomi stared at him in disbelief. Downtown. Procedure is procedure. A nurse suddenly burst through the emergency room doors, pushing through the rain with no umbrella, her pale blue scrubs already soaked dark at the shoulders. Dr. Carter, she shouted across the parking lot, panic breaking through her voice. Naomi's entire body straightened instinctively. I am right here. The nurse stopped cold when she saw the handcuffs. Confusion spread across her face first, then horror. What are you doing? She demanded, looking at Daniel. She is needed upstairs now. Daniel stepped forward immediately. Ma'am, stay back. No, you stay back, the nurse snapped. Mrs. Reeves is crashing. We have been calling Dr. Carter for 20 minutes. At the sound of the name, Daniel's posture shifted almost invisibly. Reeves, he repeated. The nurse nodded quickly. Chief Reeves' wife. Massive internal rupture after the highway collision. Dr. Carter is the only surgeon familiar with the vascular damage from the scans. The storm seemed to fall silent around them. Daniel looked slowly toward Naomi. Water dripped from the ends of her curls. Her wrists remained locked in steel. Her eyes held no triumph, no anger, only urgency and exhaustion. Then the police radio clipped to Daniel's shoulder crackled violently to life. Officer Reeves, respond immediately. Chief is requesting status on Dr. Naomi Carter. The radio crackled again, louder this time, sharp with panic. Officer Reeves, respond now. Chief Reeves is demanding an update on Dr. Carter. Daniel did not answer immediately. His hand remained frozen near the microphone clipped to his shoulder while rain hammered against the roof of the patrol car in steady, violent waves. Naomi watched his face carefully. The confidence that had filled his posture minutes earlier was beginning to fracture. Not completely, just enough to let uncertainty slip through. The nurse standing near the entrance looked seconds away from screaming. We are losing her, she said breathlessly. The blood pressure keeps crashing. We need Dr. Carter upstairs now. Daniel swallowed hard. For the first time that night, his eyes dropped fully to the steel cuffs around Naomi's wrists. Water slid down the metal and onto her skin in thin silver lines beneath the flashing police lights. Naomi said nothing. She was too tired to beg anymore. Somewhere above them on the 7th floor of Memorial General, an operating room had already been prepared. Surgical trays laid out. Ventilator humming. Nurses moving quickly beneath bright white lights. And still the room waited empty because the surgeon they needed stood locked beside a police cruiser in the rain. Daniel finally grabbed the key from his belt with stiff fingers. The cuffs opened with a soft metallic click. Naomi pulled her hands back immediately, rubbing warmth into her wrists without a word. The nurse exhaled sharply in relief. Doctor, please. Naomi did not move right away. She looked directly at Daniel instead. Rainwater dripped from her chin as ambulance sirens echoed faintly somewhere down the freeway. Do you know what the worst part is? She asked quietly. Daniel looked at her, but did not answer. It is not the handcuffs. Her voice remained calm, almost painfully calm. It is that even after everything I said, you still needed someone else to confirm I belonged here. The words settled into the cold air heavier than the storm around them. Daniel opened his mouth slightly, then stopped. Nothing came out. Naomi turned before he could try. The nurse pushed the emergency doors open and warm air rushed out into the parking lot carrying the sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic and exhaustion. Inside, the hospital moved like organized chaos. Phones ringing. Stretchers rolling across polished floors. Wet paramedics jogging through hallways beneath fluorescent lights that buzzed softly overhead. Naomi moved fast now, every step focused, every second measured in survival. A young resident met her halfway down the corridor, already holding a tablet loaded with scans. 48-year-old female, he said quickly as they walked. Massive splenic rupture from blunt force trauma during the pileup on Interstate 40. Internal bleeding worsened during transport. We stabilized twice, but she keeps crashing. Naomi scanned the images while still moving. Her expression tightened instantly. She needs surgery immediately. Where is Dr. Levin? Stuck in Charlotte because of the storm. Naomi handed the tablet back. Then prep operating room 3 now. Staff moved aside automatically as she passed. Some recognized her immediately. Others noticed the red marks still pressed into her wrists from the cuffs, but wisely said nothing. At the far end of the hallway, elevators opened and Chief Harold Reeves stepped out surrounded by 2 officers and a hospital administrator. The moment he saw Naomi striding towards surgery, still soaked from the rain, his face drained of color. "Dr. Carter," he breathed. Naomi slowed slightly, but did not stop moving. "Chief." His eyes dropped to the fading marks around her wrists, then slowly to his son standing several yards behind her near the entrance hallway, completely motionless beneath the flashing emergency lights. Understanding arrived all at once. Heavy, immediate, brutal. Harold Reeves looked back at Naomi, shame flickering openly across his face for the very first time. But Naomi only adjusted her gloves as she walked. "Your wife is still alive," she said calmly. "I plan to keep it that way." The operating room doors swung shut behind Naomi with a heavy seal that muted the chaos outside into a distant blur of footsteps and alarms. Inside, the air felt colder, sharper, cleaner. White surgical lights poured down from above with almost unnatural brightness, reflecting off stainless steel trays and polished tile floors. Machines beeped in steady nervous rhythms around the unconscious woman lying beneath warming blankets at the center of the room. Naomi stepped toward the table while nurses moved quickly around her adjusting monitors and 4 lines. "Current pressure?" she asked calmly as she scrubbed in at the sink. 80/40 and dropping, one nurse answered immediately. "Blood loss is continuing internally." Naomi nodded once. Water rushed over her hands beneath the harsh fluorescent lights while the fading red marks around her wrists remained visible against her skin. One of the younger nurses noticed them and hesitated before speaking carefully. "Dr. Carter, are you okay?" Naomi kept scrubbing without looking up. "I will be after she survives." The room fell quiet for half a second. Then everyone moved faster. Outside the operating room, Chief Harold Reeves stood rigid near the observation window with both hands pressed against his hips. His gray hair was damp from the storm, and his usually commanding posture looked suddenly older beneath the pale hospital lights. Daniel remained several feet behind him near the hallway wall, silent and motionless while nurses rushed past carrying supplies. Neither man had spoken since Naomi disappeared into surgery. The silence between father and son felt heavier than shouting ever could. Finally, Harold turned slowly toward him. "Tell me exactly what happened." Daniel swallowed once before answering. "I stopped her near the emergency entrance for reckless driving." Harold stared at him, and Daniel looked down briefly. "I thought she was lying about being a doctor." The words sounded smaller once spoken aloud. Smaller and uglier. Harold exhaled slowly through his nose as if trying to contain something deeper than anger. "You thought the trauma surgeon carrying blood to save my wife was lying." Daniel said nothing. He could still see Naomi standing in the rain with her hands raised while he ignored every warning she gave him. The memory replayed now with unbearable clarity. Her hospital ID. Her voice cracking when she said please. The look in her eyes when she realized he trusted his assumptions more than her words. Harold rubbed a hand across his face wearily. "Do you understand what would have happened if she had walked away?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Yes, sir." "No," Harold said quietly. "I do not think you do." The older man looked through the small operating room window where Naomi now stood fully gowned beneath the bright surgical lights, her focus absolute, her movements calm and precise. "That woman in there has saved police officers, firefighters, children, strangers. Last winter, she operated 12 straight hours after that school bus crash outside Durham." His voice lowered further. "And tonight she still went into that room after the way you treated her." Daniel looked toward the glass. Naomi moved steadily between monitors and surgical instruments while the medical team followed her directions without hesitation. No anger, no revenge, Just work. Just responsibility. It unsettled him more than rage would have. Down the hallway, a television mounted near the waiting area quietly replayed storm coverage from the interstate collision that had caused the massive pileup earlier that evening. Rain flooded across the screen beneath flashing emergency lights, almost identical to the ones still reflecting in Daniel's memory. A reporter spoke softly about multiple injuries and delayed ambulance routes due to severe weather conditions. Daniel barely heard it. His attention remained fixed on the operating room window. Inside, Naomi leaned closer toward the patient while a monitor suddenly emitted a sharp warning tone. Several nurses moved instantly. The room tightened with urgency all over again. Harold took one unconscious step toward the glass. Daniel felt his chest lock painfully as he realized something terrifying for the first time that night. The woman he had humiliated in the rain now held his mother's life in her hands. The warning tone inside the operating room sharpened suddenly into a long, continuous alarm that sliced through the hallway like ice. Every head near the observation window turned at once. Chief Harold Reeves stepped forward instinctively, his breath catching as nurses moved rapidly around the operating table behind the glass. Daniel felt his stomach drop. Inside the room, Naomi did not panic. She never raised her voice, never rushed blindly. Her focus narrowed instead, calm and absolute beneath the bright surgical lights reflecting against the shield over her face. "Pressure is falling," one nurse warned. "We are losing volume again." Naomi extended her hand without looking away from the patient. Clamp. The instrument touched her palm immediately. Her gloves were streaked dark from hours of surgery, but her hands remained steady. Around her, machines beeped faster while rain continued to hammer the hospital windows beyond the operating room walls. The storm outside had not let up once all night. Neither had she. In the hallway, Daniel watched through the glass, unable to pull his eyes away. He had spent years believing confidence meant control. Believing authority meant never second-guessing himself. But standing there now, watching the woman he had handcuffed fight calmly to save another human life, something inside him felt painfully small. A young officer approached quietly from down the corridor carrying coffee cups in a cardboard tray. "Chief," he said gently, "thought you might need this." Harold barely acknowledged him. His eyes remained fixed on the operating room. "How long has she been in there?" "Almost 4 hours," the officer answered softly. Daniel looked at the clock, mounted above the nurse's station. "For hours. For hours since Naomi arrived soaked from the rain with steel cuffs around her wrists. For hours since he decided suspicion mattered more than urgency." The realization pressed heavier against his chest with every passing minute. Inside surgery, another alarm sounded sharply. Naomi looked toward the monitor for half a second before speaking with quiet authority. "Start another transfusion now." "Doctor, the pressure is still unstable." Naomi leaned closer, studying the internal scan displayed beside the table. Then suddenly she saw it. Tiny, nearly invisible. A hidden vascular tear missed during the earlier emergency assessment because of swelling from the crash. "There," she said immediately. "Suction." The room moved around her instantly. A nurse adjusted lighting while another handed over instruments with practiced speed. Naomi's eyes never left the patient. Outside the glass, Harold watched every movement with silent desperation. Daniel noticed something then that unsettled him deeply. Naomi never once hesitated. Not after the humiliation. Not after the assumptions. Not after being treated like a threat outside the very hospital she served every day. She could have walked away. She could have refused. Instead, she stayed. The thought hollowed him out from the inside. Down the hallway, 2 older nurses whispered quietly near the reception desk, unaware Daniel could hear them. "That is Dr. Carter in there," one asked softly. The other nodded immediately. "Best trauma surgeon this hospital has. I heard she worked 36 hours straight during the hurricane flooding last year. She practically lived here during the pandemic." Daniel lowered his eyes toward the floor tiles beneath his boots. Every sentence felt heavier than the last. He remembered the way Naomi had looked at him in the rain after he ignored her hospital badge. Not angry, not surprised even, just tired. Tired in a way that suggested this was not new for her. The operating room suddenly went quiet. Too quiet. The long warning tone disappeared. Everyone near the observation window held their breath. Naomi remained bent slightly over the operating table for several seconds longer before finally straightening. One nurse looked toward the monitor first, then another. Slowly, the steady rhythm of a healthy heartbeat filled the room again. Harold closed his eyes immediately, his shoulders sagging with relief, so sudden it almost looked painful. Daniel stared through the glass at Naomi as she removed her gloves slowly beneath the bright, white lights. For the first time all night, he realized something terrifyingly simple. The strongest person in the building had been the woman standing in handcuffs in the rain. The operating room doors finally opened a little after 3 in the morning. Warm, sterile air spilled into the hallway, carrying the faint scent of antiseptic and exhaustion. Naomi stepped out slowly, removing her surgical cap as damp curls fell against the sides of her face. Deep shadows rested beneath her eyes now. For straight hours beneath harsh lights and relentless pressure had drained every ounce of strength from her body, but her posture remained steady. Chief Harold Reeves moved toward her immediately, stopping just short of reaching for her. For a second, he looked less like the most respected police chief in Raleigh and more like a frightened husband waiting for permission to breathe again. Naomi pulled off her gloves carefully before speaking. She made it through surgery. Harold closed his eyes at once. The breath that left him sounded almost shaky. Behind him, nurses passing through the corridor slowed instinctively as relief spread quietly through the waiting area, like warmth returning after a storm. The bleeding is under control, Naomi continued calmly. The next 24 hours matter, but right now her condition is stable. Harold nodded several times, unable to speak right away. Daniel stood farther down the hallway near the observation window, hands locked tightly behind his back. He watched Naomi carefully as she spoke with his father. Even exhausted, even carrying the weight of everything that had happened outside in the rain, she still spoke gently, professionally, like the night had not carved humiliation into her skin only hours earlier. Harold finally found his voice. "Dr. Carter." He stopped, swallowing hard. "You saved my wife." Naomi gave a small, tired nod. "That is my job." The simplicity of the answer hit harder than gratitude would have. Harold glanced briefly toward the faint red marks still visible around her wrists beneath the fluorescent lights. Shame crossed his face openly now. What happened tonight should never have happened. Naomi looked at him quietly for a moment. The hallway had grown still around them. Even the storm outside seemed softer now, rain tapping gently against distant windows instead of crashing against them. "No," she said softly. "It should not have." Daniel lowered his eyes toward the polished floor tiles. The words settled into him heavily because she did not say them with anger. That would have been easier to face. Instead, her voice carried something quieter. Weariness. The kind that comes from surviving the same judgment over and over until disappointment becomes familiar. Naomi leaned briefly against the wall beside the operating room doors, finally allowing exhaustion to show through. One of the nurses handed her a small paper cup of water. "Thank you," she whispered before taking a slow sip. Her hands trembled slightly now that the adrenaline had begun fading away. Harold noticed immediately. "You need to rest." Naomi let out the faintest breath of humorless laughter. "There are still 3 trauma patients downstairs from the pileup." Harold stared at her in disbelief. "You cannot be serious." "A 12-year-old boy came in with chest injuries 20 minutes before your wife arrived," Naomi replied. "Another patient is still waiting on neurological scans." She pushed gently away from the wall. "People do not stop needing help because I am tired." Daniel felt something tighten painfully in his chest at those words. He remembered the moment he ignored her hospital badge beneath the rain. The moment he assumed danger before compassion. Suspicion before truth. Naomi adjusted the sleeve of her scrub jacket slightly, covering the fading marks on her wrists without drawing attention to them. Then she looked toward the elevators leading back down to emergency intake. "Excuse me," she said softly. "There are still patients waiting." Harold watched her walk away beneath the pale hospital lights while exhausted nurses and residents moved respectfully aside for her in the hallway. No applause followed her. No dramatic moment. Just quiet admiration. Daniel remained frozen near the observation window long after she disappeared from sight, because for the first time in his life, silence felt heavier than authority. By sunrise, the storm had finally begun to loosen its grip over Raleigh. Thin gray light filtered through the tall emergency room windows, washing the hospital corridors in a cold, quiet glow. Most of the overnight staff looked drained now, their movements slower, their voices softer after endless hours of trauma cases from the interstate pileup. Naomi stood alone at the nurse's station reviewing a chart with tired eyes, while a cup of untouched coffee cooled beside her elbow. Her scrub jacket was wrinkled from the long night, and faint bruised shadows rested beneath her eyes, but she remained focused line by line through every patient update on the screen. Across the hallway, Daniel stepped out of the elevator carrying something awkwardly in his hands. A small paper bag from the hospital cafe and a fresh cup of coffee. He stopped several feet away from her, suddenly unsure of himself in a way he had never experienced before. Naomi sensed him before she looked up. The moment her eyes met his, silence stretched tightly between them again. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "Dr. Carter." Naomi waited calmly. He glanced down once before speaking again. "I brought you coffee." She looked briefly at the cup in his hand, then back at him. "Thank you." Her voice remained polite but distant. Daniel nodded awkwardly and placed both items carefully on the counter near her charts. For a moment neither spoke. Around them, monitors beeped softly while morning staff filtered through the corridor with clipboards and tablets tucked beneath their arms. The hospital was waking into another long day, while the weight of the night before still hung between them unresolved. Finally, Daniel exhaled slowly. "I owe you an apology." Naomi's expression did not change. "Yes," she said quietly. The honesty of the answer hit him harder than anger would have. Daniel looked toward the floor briefly before forcing himself to continue. "I thought I was being cautious. I thought I was following procedure." Naomi folded the patient chart closed. "Procedure did not put handcuffs on me," she replied softly. "You did." Daniel swallowed hard. The red marks had faded from her wrists now, but somehow that made the memory worse instead of better. "You are right," he admitted. "I judged you before I listened to you." Naomi studied him silently for a few seconds. There was no hatred in her face, no satisfaction, just exhaustion layered over years of experience he was only beginning to understand. "Do you know how many times people have questioned whether I belong in this hospital?" she asked quietly. Daniel did not answer. Naomi leaned lightly against the counter beside the glowing computer monitor. "Patients ask if I am part of the cleaning staff. Families assume I am the nurse even after I introduce myself as the surgeon. Last year, a pharmaceutical representative handed paperwork to a white intern standing beside me because he thought she was the doctor." Her voice never rose. That somehow made every word heavier. "After a while, you stop being surprised." Daniel felt heat crawl into his face. He had no defense left. Naomi looked toward the large emergency room windows where the rain had finally slowed to a mist beneath the pale morning sky. "The dangerous part is not one bad moment," she continued softly. "It is when someone in authority stops seeing people clearly because assumptions feel easier than listening." Daniel stared at her quietly. Somewhere down the hall, a little boy laughed weakly while a nurse adjusted his blanket after treatment. The sound echoed softly through the early morning stillness. Naomi looked back at Daniel then. Last night could have ended very differently. He nodded once, shame written openly across his face now. "I know." Naomi studied him for another long moment before picking up the fresh coffee cup he brought her. The warmth spread slowly into her tired hands. "Then make sure you remember it," she said. Gently, not cruelly, not angrily, just truthfully. Daniel lowered his eyes because for the first time in his career, he understood that guilt was not punishment. Clarity was. 2 days later, the storm clouds over Raleigh had disappeared completely. Morning sunlight spilled across the front windows of Memorial General, warming the pale marble floors near the main lobby. Patients moved quietly through the hospital entrance carrying flowers, coffee cups, and overnight bags while nurses traded shifts beneath the soft hum of fluorescent lights. The building had returned to its normal rhythm, but for Daniel Reeves, nothing felt normal anymore. He sat alone in his patrol car across the street from the hospital with the engine off and both hands resting motionless on the steering wheel. He had been there nearly 20 minutes staring at the entrance without fully understanding why he could not make himself leave. The radio beside him crackled occasionally with routine dispatch calls, but he barely heard any of them. His thoughts kept returning to the same image over and over again. Naomi standing in the rain with her hospital ID in one hand and handcuffs around her wrists anyway. He finally stepped out of the vehicle and crossed the street slowly. Inside the hospital, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh coffee from the cafe near the waiting area. Daniel nodded awkwardly at the front desk clerk before moving toward the elevators. Several people recognized him from the police department, but he avoided eye contact. He had spent most of his life walking through rooms with confidence. Today, every step felt heavier than the last. On the 7th floor, he found Chief Harold Reeves standing outside Evelyn's recovery room, holding a paper cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. The older man looked exhausted but calmer than before. Through the half-open door, Evelyn rested quietly beneath pale blankets, while soft morning lights stretched across the room from the nearby windows. Harold looked up as Daniel approached. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Harold broke the silence. "Your mother asked about Dr. Carter first thing this morning." Daniel glanced toward the room. "How is she?" "Better." Harold nodded once. "Because someone chose professionalism over pride." The words settled heavily between them. Daniel looked down briefly before speaking carefully. "I keep replaying it in my head." Harold studied his son for a moment. "Good." Daniel blinked slightly. Harold stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Because if this only embarrasses you, then you learn nothing. But if it changes the way you see people, then maybe something decent comes out of it." Daniel swallowed hard. A nurse walked past carrying medication trays, while monitors beeped softly down the corridor. Life inside the hospital continued steadily around them, indifferent to guilt, rank, or regret. Harold looked through the recovery room doorway again before speaking quietly. "You know what your mother said after she woke up?" Daniel shook his head. "She said the surgeon holding her hand before anesthesia reminded her to keep breathing, because fear lies to people when they are hurting." Harold exhaled slowly. "That woman comforted your mother minutes after you humiliated her outside." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. The shame hit differently now. Deeper. Not because he had been wrong, but because Naomi had every reason to resent them and chose compassion anyway. At the far end of the hallway, the elevator doors opened softly. Naomi stepped out wearing dark blue scrubs beneath a light gray coat, her hospital badge swinging gently against the fabric as she walked. Several nurses greeted her warmly in passing. One patient's daughter stopped just to thank her quietly before continuing down the hall. Naomi acknowledged each person with the same calm grace she carried inside the operating room. Then she noticed Daniel and Harold standing outside the recovery suite. Her steps slowed slightly, but she kept walking toward them. Daniel straightened immediately. Harold spoke first. "Dr. Carter, Evelyn would like to see you when you have time." Naomi gave a polite nod. "Of course." Then silence settled again for a moment beneath the soft hospital lights. Daniel looked at her carefully. No anger lived in her expression. No triumph either. Just quiet composure. Finally he spoke softly. "I am going to carry what happened that night for a very long time." Naomi studied him for a second before answering. "Then carry it the right way." 3 weeks later, Memorial General stood quiet beneath the soft gold light of early evening. The storm that had once flooded the city felt like a distant memory now, replaced by warm spring air drifting through the hospital courtyard and the steady rhythm of ordinary life returning again. Nurses changed shifts near the main entrance carrying tote bags and half-finished coffees, while families slowly filtered through the lobby, visiting loved ones upstairs. Near the curb outside the emergency wing, an ambulance pulled away with its siren low and distant against the fading sunset. Naomi Carter stepped through the sliding hospital doors with a tired canvas bag resting against one shoulder and patient files tucked beneath her arm. Her shift had lasted nearly 14 hours. She looked exhausted, but there was still gentleness in the way she thanked the security guard holding the door open for her. The evening breeze caught lightly against her curls as she paused near the front steps, finally taking a slow breath outside the walls of the hospital. Across the parking lot, a familiar patrol vehicle sat beneath the glow of a street lamp. Daniel Reeves leaned quietly against the hood with his uniform sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms and a small paper bag resting beside him. He noticed Naomi almost immediately and straightened awkwardly, suddenly unsure of what to do with his hands. Naomi spotted him too. For a moment, neither moved. Then Daniel stepped forward slowly. "Dr. Carter." His voice carried none of the authority it once had that rainy night. Only sincerity. Naomi adjusted the strap on her shoulder slightly. "Officer Reeves." Daniel held out the paper bag carefully. "Blueberry muffin," he said quietly. "The cafe nurse told me it is the only thing you actually eat during long shifts." Naomi looked at the bag for a second before a faint, tired smile touched the corner of her mouth for the very first time since they met. Small, brief, real. You asked the nurses about me? Daniel nodded once. I figured listening would be a better start than assuming. The words settled softly between them beneath the fading sunlight. Naomi accepted the paper bag gently. Nearby, traffic rolled steadily down the street, while the hospital windows behind them glowed warm against the darkening sky. Daniel glanced toward the emergency entrance where paramedics were unloading another patient onto a stretcher. I transferred out of highway patrol last week, he admitted quietly. Naomi looked at him with mild surprise. Why? Daniel slipped his hands into his pockets slowly. Because I realized I had gotten too comfortable seeing situations before seeing people. He paused briefly. My father said authority without humility becomes dangerous. Naomi looked toward the hospital for a moment, watching nurses move quickly beneath the bright emergency room lights. He is not wrong. Daniel nodded. I keep thinking about what you said. Naomi raised her eyes toward him again. Which part? That assumptions feel easier than listening. The evening wind moved softly through the trees lining the hospital walkway. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed while chasing bubbles drifting across the courtyard from a street performer near the corner cafe. Naomi held the warm paper bag lightly between her hands. Most people think change happens in one big moment, she said quietly. Usually it happens in smaller choices after the moment is over. Daniel absorbed the words carefully. No defensiveness remained in him now. Only understanding slowly taking root where certainty once lived. Behind them, the sliding hospital doors opened again as another trauma call came over the overhead speakers. Naomi immediately glanced back toward the entrance on instinct alone. Duty still lived inside her stronger than exhaustion ever could. Daniel noticed it and stepped aside automatically. They need you. Naomi gave a small nod. Before turning away, she looked at him one final time beneath the soft amber glow of the streetlights. Take care of people before your pride, she said gently. You will make fewer mistakes that way. Then she walked back toward the emergency room doors while the evening light reflected softly against her hospital badge. Daniel remained standing near the curb long after she disappeared inside. The city moved around him in quiet motion. Traffic lights changed. Ambulances came and went. Somewhere overhead, the last storm clouds drifted beyond the skyline. And for the first time in a very long time, Daniel Reeves understood that respect was not proven by power. It was proven by how clearly someone chose to see another human being.